storytelling changes through the product lifecycle. In the beginning, you use it a lot to get people on board. Leadership, alignment, right? Making sure folks are going to fund it, are going to support it. But once you get through that initial stage, you still have to keep telling that story because there's so much work through the planning phase, through the execution phase, even through the conclusion of the project, right? That the storytelling has to be consistent, like have those consistent threads, but it has to adapt to the different audiences and it has to adapt to the different things you're trying to accomplish with your story.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
Welcome. Here we are again for the Product Agility Podcast. This time around, we are joined by Tara Wellington. Tara is on a mission to help small businesses thrive. Small businesses have been the connective tissue throughout Tara's product career, from GoDaddy to PandaDoc and now at Build.com, where she leads their CX platform. Tara loves to explore nature with her husband and two kids, especially in their home state of NH, which I discovered means New Hampshire.
Yeah. The wilds of New Hampshire.
So first of all, importantly, are there wilds in New Hampshire?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Philadelphia and then we spent the last 8 years in Scottsdale. So moving to New Hampshire does feel very wild for me. There's woods around, there's bears. There were deer eating all my plants this morning. I was like, get out. So it is a little wild compared to, Philadelphia streets I grew up on.
Deer, love them. Bears, bears are a bit scary.
They're like small black bears. We don't really have like grizzly bears.
No. That's fine then. That's fine. So Tara, you are quite the product person. So you are senior director of product management at Bill, and you're a Reforge executive partner, which that's some accomplishment, I would say.
It sounds fancy.
Because it is fancy. It is fancy. And you've been an executive partner at Reforge, or at least involved with Reforge. How long have you been involved with them for now?
I first got into the community maybe in November of last year. Although we didn't really start doing a lot of collaborative content until the spring. Because they have different topics that folks are interested in, that they want experts to speak on. And they were pretty invested in growth, which is an amazing topic. It's just not my area of expertise. So we didn't have a lot of opportunities to collaborate. Then the spring, there was a bunch of opportunities that fit pretty well into my wheelhouse. So we talked about product and design collaborating. We talked about the misuse of user stories. I know we chatted a bit on LinkedIn about that article about PM career growth. And now I've been working with Reforge on a course around storytelling.
And I think that's what I'm most interested to start with. Every story, much like every podcast episode. In fact, most things in life have a beginning, a middle, and an end if you choose to look closely enough. And I thought that then perhaps for this episode, we could begin with exploring this idea of storytelling. The first question I've got in my head there is that storytelling, when I've been to conferences, particularly product conferences, it's all about telling a story in a really big, critical kind of pitch, or you're trying to win someone over, or trying to get people to align up on a roadmap, or something else. And these are big, high-stakes storytelling opportunities. As I understand it, your approach in this course is somewhat different for product managers. Is that correct?
Yeah, everybody's heard of storytelling, right? People do storytelling all different ways and throughout their day, through their career, through their family, through their friends. There's lots of different ways to engage with stories. And I think when thinking about storytelling in the work setting, a lot of people do think about these big moments. Oh, I've got to go give a story to our CEO, or I've got an investor pitch I've got to make, and I've got to do this great succinct story. And I'm going to go up there, I'm going to win everybody over, and they're going to clap at my storytelling and say, like, what an incredible storyteller you are, right? And that is one part of storytelling. But the part that we focus on in the course is actually really how storytelling threads through your day-to-day life as a product manager, and how it can really accelerate not only your career, but your success in the work that you're trying to do. Because so much of what we're trying to do every day as product leaders, product managers, is gain buy-in, get alignment with their teams, get people motivated, inspired about the work that we're doing, help people understand the why behind what we're trying to accomplish rather than just go through the motions. And storytelling is a really powerful tool to do all those things. And as PM, you're always talking to different audiences, right? You're having to talk to leadership, you're having to talk to your team, engineers, designers, stakeholders. You've got people you're dependent on that you've got to talk into doing work. And so there's different things these audiences want to hear, and you're going to want to be able to speak to them in a way that they're going to want to engage. And so storytelling is this critical tool that you're kind of using all the time. And if you can learn to do it well, it can really unlock a lot of power for you as a PM.
And so you've piqued my interest, because storytelling, as you say, it's something which is mentioned a lot. And maybe it's become overloaded, or maybe people just use it too much. I don't know. So I'm really fascinated when you're saying storytelling, at least conceptually. What are we talking about here?
I love where this question is going, because a lot of people feel like storytelling is this like inherent skill. It's something that some people have. They have this like magnetism, and they have this ability to like read a room and, work people, right? Like it's this thing that you have to be born with, or you have to like work really hard at. But storytelling at its crux is just a structure like anything else, and anybody can learn to use it, and anybody can learn to do it well, right? It doesn't have to be this thing that is one of your like core built-in skills. And like you said earlier, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, if you think about generic structures of a story, we talk about this a lot in the course. You have a beginning, there's something that happens, and there's a result, and then there's a character that kind of goes through that. Well, when you're talking about a story in the PM context, there's things that change a little bit, not only depending on your audience, but actually depending on where you are in the product lifecycle. For example, if you're telling a story before you're doing something that you want to happen, you think of a lot of stories are kind of look back, right? Here's the character, here's what they went through, here's what happened. But when you're storytelling in a PM setting, you're actually projecting forward. You're saying, okay, here's the character. Maybe it's your customer. Maybe it's an internal customer. Maybe it's a cost-saving story, and you're talking about your finance partner. But there's some character. There's some sort of current state problem that they have. There's some action you want to take to get to a desired end state. And so you have to articulate the problem. You have to articulate where you're trying to get to, like what the result will be if you solve it, and how you think you should solve it, right? So it's projecting forward. And when you're in the business setting, it's not just the character that goes through it. There's these parallel pieces of here's what the character is going through, but also here how the business is impacted by that. So you're pairing a customer problem with a business opportunity. You're pairing a customer result with the business result of that, right? And then how your action is going to be projected for it.
And I think it's easy for people to take that for granted, isn't it? Almost that by doing what we believe is the right thing to do by our customers, that then people will just know that's working towards our greater organizational purpose or a greater outcome, which we're striving towards. But people don't make those connections, do they, often, because people will just have an idea of a solution to solve something, or want to prioritize a pet project, even though objectively that does not contribute to the things which we're all supposed to be contributing towards at the moment. So what you're saying is that by creating that linkage between the customer need or the opportunity and the business, the desired business outcomes and the business goals, that you can help take people on that journey and see that actually you're telling them, the storyteller, the PM, is explaining the problem and explaining a desired end state, and then explaining how the actor and the action then, or how it all contributes and comes together to achieving our collective goal.
Yeah. So one really important thing to think about is, what story are you going to tell? You want to pick the right story. Storytelling is a tool, but it's not magic. You can't be like, I want to tell a story of something that I care about that's completely impossible. And my storytelling skills are going to go make that happen. There's a couple things that have to be true for your story to even make sense for the business, right? Like, one, does it align with the company goals and what the company's trying to do? If it doesn't, it's going to be really hard for anybody to really buy into that. Is it possible? Right? If you're McDonald's and all of a sudden you're going to say, we're going to go start selling healthcare services, like, it just doesn't fundamentally make sense, right? Nobody's going to buy that story. So there's these things that need to be true about your story to really make it even worth telling. But the beautiful thing that stories do is that they take ideas, and what they do is they make them more concrete. So you have the structure, but what you do is you wrap content around that structure to make an idea tangible, to make it believable, to make it feel real, and to connect people to it in an emotional way, right? Like, why should they care about this? Why? And that's why having a character is really important. Because if you're always talking about the business or this like general entity, right, in your story, it doesn't have the same hit as like, okay, here's Julia, and she was one of our customers, and here's this problem that she was struggling with, and here's what it would look like to solve that, and here's the business impact of solving that, and here's how we want to go solve that, and here's the ask we have for you so that we can go solve that. It's a different way to help people understand how to connect with it than just putting an idea on paper.
I love it. Yeah. I love that. I love it. Something I've mentioned this stat, and I said in a few different episodes. There was this research done by two people called Price and Toy that showed that teams that had a close proximity to their customer were statistically much more likely, I can't remember the exact number, much more likely to be improving and reaching higher performance compared to the teams that didn't have that proximity. And I think proximity isn't just physical proximity, it's the perceived proximity. If you can take an anonymous blob of something like the business or our customer, but put a name to it and put a face to it and actually tell a story and get people to relate, to connect, as you were saying, to the story emotionally, then their empathetic understanding increases. And then they say, oh, well, this person's experiencing a problem, or this is a really great thing. I think that's that motivation then that storytelling can bring is like really powerful. And I can see how on a day-to-day basis as a product manager, these types of stories should then motivate most people that you speak to, hopefully, if you can do a good job to solve the right needs and help achieve the right outcomes. So then what I'm wondering is, if the characters are so important, and you mentioned, I can't remember the person's name that you said, was it Julie or something?
Julia.
Yeah, good old Julia. Was it?
She's a good old friend of ours.
I was with a product manager called Julia yesterday, facilitating a vision workshop, actually, where there's lots and lots of talk about customers and lots of stories being told. So that's kind of an amusing coincidence. However,
I like this. It's like
it's meant to be.
Telepathy we've got going.
One day I'll get Julia on here, but let's see. Anyway, so then do you find that you're taking, I don't know, that's the wrong question, I'm taking personas, but if there are personas which have been documented, which are being shared, which are used as part of the product management approach or the agile approach, whatever it may be, do you find that people can hook into existing personas, or do you recommend that people just get off their asses and go and do some research, and instead of just making up a Julia, actually find information which backs up the assumptions they got about who this Julia is?
Yeah, I mentioned that some of the reasons storytelling works is because it takes an idea and it makes it feel tangible and believable. So anytime you can use a real person, a real character, that obviously ups the believability factor, right? Certainly something that I love to do in storytelling. It's not always possible. If your company has a really great set of personas that's well socialized, people know, that's obviously something you can do as well. If you don't have any of that, get out and go get some research, right? It doesn't always have to be like, you can make up a persona, a name for your story. However, like, you have to have something backing it up. And we talk about this a lot in the course. And this is the part where the work behind storytelling comes. It's not just about the tonation of your voice and how you communicate and how you inspire people in that moment. It's about the work you put into the story before you tell it, so that it is believable, so that it is tangible and real. And that includes bringing all the content that backs it up. What's the data you have to support this? What is the customer research you have to support this? What are the reasons why you want to tell the story in the first place, right? You have to assume if you're telling a story, you care about it, you're passionate about it, you believe in it. Why, right? You have to get that across to folks in a way that they're going to have the same passion about that story as you are. And that's a lot of what the course is how do you do that in a way to make sure people can walk out of that story feeling the same connection to it that you do.
Yeah, it's the believability factor, but also then the confidence, right? Because something may be believable, but people may not have confidence that the likelihood of these somewhat believable things is high. So it's having high confidence that actually the story you are telling is based in some data, research, subjective, objective, but it's not just something you're making up. People have to walk away from that saying, I can see that story could be a reality.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why anybody can do it, right? There are some people that can get up and tell a story with none of that and win people over, right? However, anybody can go do good research, get good data, bring it together, use the story structure, tell it in a way that is clear, structured, succinct, and get people on board, right? And that's where we also talk a lot about how storytelling changes through the product lifecycle. In the beginning, you use it a lot to get people on board. Leadership, alignment, right? Making sure folks are going to fund it, are going to support it. But once you get through that initial stage, you still have to keep telling that story because there's so much work through the planning phase, through the execution phase, even through the conclusion of the project, that the storytelling has to have those consistent threads, but it has to adapt to the different audiences and it has to adapt to the different things you're trying to accomplish with your story. And so that's where the preparation comes in too, making sure you know your audience and you know your point in time to make sure you're getting what you need from your story.
Have you got an example of a story which you have told or a narrative which takes on that product life cycle? The gap for me is now understanding how does that manifest? Is there a story you could tell us about the storytelling process?
Sure. Yeah. So when I was at GoDaddy, we were starting work on what we called the partners experience. And the partners experience was a way for web pros and web professionals who were engaging with GoDaddy to come into the experience and feel like it was tailored for them. Because the majority of GoDaddy had been built for small businesses, right? For solopreneurs, people coming in, doing things on behalf of themselves. But we had this huge cohort of customers who were using it as a platform to deliver services for others. And we had never really built an experience that was tailored for them. So we started off with research, really trying to understand the problem, understanding what we wanted to do. And what we did is we built a vision that was like, here's what could be possible. But we had a character that went through it. We had little videos that showed like what it could look like. And what we did is we showed the business opportunity of what would happen if we could solve that. And then we took that to leadership. And so that was how we got the initial support and funding to go invest in this, to get the teams, to get folks working together. Then once we had the initial, okay, we're going to go do this, we had to get the team on board. We had 3 new engineering teams, we had designers, and they're all like, what are we working on? Well, we have to tell a story to them around why does this matter? What do we care about? How do we want to go do this? And so all of a sudden you move from buy-in phase to planning. You're still getting buy-in from your team, but they care about slightly different things, right? They're going to want to know more of the details of, okay, this is a great vision, but what's the first bite we take? What's the first thing that matters to these customers? How do we then break down this bigger thing into the smaller pieces that we can then go start planning and making progress on, So we still tell the big story, but then your storytelling starts to get narrower and narrower. But you have to keep that thread. Like, let's remember our customer through all of this. Let's remember our goals through all of this, what we're trying to accomplish. So your story is still the glue that's keeping the team together as they're planning. Then you're going through execution. You've got to keep all those teams executing aligned, and you've got to keep all of your leadership and all of your stakeholders informed of the progress. How are things going? What's coming when? How is this going to impact? How is this delivering on that story you told? And so your story is continuing to hold its structure, but the content and the way you tell it is starting to change depending on where you are in that process. And then you get to these milestones of your beta or your launches, your experiments, right? And so you're telling the story again, but you're now telling it as a look back rather than a look forward, right? And you're saying, this is what we set out to do. These were the goals we wanted to accomplish. Here's what happened. Here's what we learned, right? So it's still the same story, but you're shifting it and looking at it from different angles depending on where you are. And we talk about that a lot in the course. How do you change what those different audiences want? How do you adjust your content? And those are the things that really deep dive in the course.
At the beginning, when I introduced you, we said that small businesses, there's a connective tissue that's going to bound your career together. What we're saying here about storytelling as a product manager more generally, that storytelling can be the connective tissue through which your vision, your strategy, and your tactics, and then the return on investment you're getting from that is what you can hold it all together.
Exactly. Yes. And the important thing is that story structure, like the content can change, the proof points can change depending on your audience or where you're going, but the structure has to stay the same. Because if you start changing the core structure, you start to lose some of that believability, some of the pieces that really got your project going in the first place, right? So you want to keep that. That's how you build trust. That's how you build momentum, is that people still feel like, okay, we're making progress on this same thing. Even if you've learned something, things have shifted, things have changed, maybe you have to take a pivot, maybe you have to move a different direction. You still have a character, right? You still have a goal that you were trying to get to. And then if you do have a major shift where, oh man, this is the wrong character, this is the wrong goal, that's part of your story, right? And then you have to articulate and how you shift that.
Unfortunately, Julia tripped over and fell off a cliff.
It's Jude now. We're going after Jude.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Julia had a lovely funeral, and now we're on to Jude because Jude's an opportunity.
This got morbid quick.
We said earlier, it has to be backed up by some kind of data. It can't be things which you're making up, which maybe seem plausible but just aren't true, or there's no data to back that up. When you are teaching people this technique, do you find, or have you ever used like metaphors to drive the story, or do you keep it grounded in like a concrete reality?
I try to keep it concrete. I mean, there's certainly like language and techniques and things like that, which you hear in other storytelling classes, right? Make sure you're making eye contact and you're looking up and you're like power posing, right? Like,
power posing.
Power posing.
Power posing. Like, is that with like your fists in your hips? That's a bit.
Yeah.
Nice.
So there are a lot of those types of things that you can use, but I think at the end of the day, when you're using it in a work setting, especially now that we're in like a super global, like connected workforce, not everybody English is a first language. Not everybody has the same background to like understand different stories, right? Like sometimes you're like, oh, this is like a Cinderella story. And people are like, well, who's Cinderella, right? So there's things where you kind of have to be a little careful and using, I think the best part and the best way to tell a story is to make it simple, easy to understand, and powerful, right? Like it doesn't have to be complicated to be powerful. It doesn't have to be overly complex. It doesn't have to have every single data point in the world for it to make sense. Actually, I think a well-structured, succinct, clear story actually gets you a heck of a lot further in the workplace than like an overly like floral language and overly dramatic and overly sold, because then the story relies on you to be told. And that's something I hear people a lot. People are like, I need to be the storyteller, or they feel this pressure on their shoulders of like, I have to do the story. Well, a story can be a collective thing too, right? Even if you're starting it, but say you're working on a team and you have a designer and an engineer and a product person and a researcher, you're all collaborating on building a story together. And each person on that team can go tell it. And then if they get it, and they can tell that story. And so if you have this story that's simple, easy to remember, easy to grab onto, the story can actually like get legs past even just what you're telling individually. So I actually do think keeping it simple is a great way to have a lot more impact in the business setting.
Yeah. Simple, easy to understand, and powerful. And I think that's fantastic advice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for all of our communication. And I assume then that if I think about contexts that I have been in, that those simple, powerful stories cut through all the BS in an organization and actually show people a route to the thing that really matters. And if then your story can live beyond you, and I think, and I don't know this for sure, but there is great articulations of how our cultures were based upon stories. We passed down stories from generation to generation. A lot of communities thrived and were driven and survived, and stories were enshrined in law and our morals and our values and beliefs, and not because they were overly complex or beautifully written, but because people could own them and tell the story. And that's what we're saying here then, is that if you can tell a good story, if it's simple, easy to understand and powerful, and then that story lives beyond you and anyone can tell that story, then that is more connective tissue, which ties together the vision to the actual, to seeing the return, right? And making a difference to your user, having them choose to change their behavior in some way to use the thing that you have them put in front of them.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working on a product vision right now, Bill. And so we're working on a storyboard and the character, and here are the moments of truth they're going to go through. Obviously, we want that to be beautifully told and it to be impactful and it to have all of the video and the imagery so people can be like, oh, this is real and this is that. But I think the most important thing is that people can take that and then say, okay, how am I part of this story? How do I contribute to making this story? So they're not going to remember every single moment in truth. They're not going to remember every single piece of data that goes into making that story real. But what they will remember is hopefully the character, how they felt, what we wanted the outcomes to be. Because one of the main points of a vision story, there's all different types of stories, right? But a vision story is about inspiration and motivation and getting people excited. And so that they turn their brain on and they're like, oh, how can I help make this happen?
Yeah, it's how
and
do you...
That's where they can end.
It's interesting. You mentioned a product like a storyboard. Was it Airbnb? I think there's an article online that talks about how they define their vision using a storyboarding technique. Actually,
oh, nice.
Yeah, and I did a quick look for it, but I couldn't find it. I think it was Airbnb, and they had a lovely storyboard that gave people something to relate to. So you mentioned before, as long as you stick to the core structure, and going to keep to the core structure of the story. Could you just go over and perhaps reiterate that what are those core elements that you feel have to remain the same if you're telling the story?
Yeah, so when you're talking about any generic story, there's the main character. We talked about, you can think about the PAR framework, right? A lot of people use this for interviews, right? Problem, action, result. When you're telling a product story in a business setting, a couple things change. You don't just have the main character, but you have the business. And so the main character and the business have to go through the story. You have to pair them. Because if you only talk about the character and not the impact of the business, you're going to lose some of the, like, why should we do this? if you only talk about the business and not the character, you're also going to lose some of the why does this matter to people? So that's a little bit different in the business setting. But you're still kind of going to have that problem, action, result. But the main thing that's going to change is you're going to start with the problem, but it's a customer problem. It might be a business opportunity of solving that customer problem. So those kind of pair. You're actually then going to switch to talk about the result before the action, right? Because it's a desired result. Like, this is the problem for the customer. Here's the desired end state for the customer. Here's the opportunity. Here's what we could get, I'll just say it for lack of a better word, as the business, if this customer is able to get this result. And then that's your action, because your action is your pitch. Your action is what you want to do, right? Like, look, there's an opportunity. There's a problem to solve. There's something we could win for the customer, for the business, if we did this. And that's usually what people are trying to tell with their story. They're trying to get buy-in around this thing they want to go do. But the problem and the opportunity and the result are the reason behind the why you want to go do that. And then at the end, you get a little extra when you're in the business setting, especially when you're at the beginning of your story. The extra A, it's your ask. Okay, what do you want from your audience? Because you can tell a story all day long. You have to ask them for something. Like, what do I need from you? Why am I telling you this story? You may be like, that's cool, great story. But if they walk away being like, that was interesting, you didn't really get your job done. You want people to walk away and say, okay, I get it. This makes sense. This is what they need from me. Let me go take an action on that. Or let me approve this. Or let me get involved. And the ask is really critical. Otherwise, your story can't have an impact. Right?
No, I mean, where's the momentum if you're not asking? Unless you're just dependent upon people turning around and saying, oh, great, here's a yes, whatever you want, or here's some money. And so there is an element of, if you don't ask, you don't get. So why wouldn't you ask for something at the end there?
And that's true for any audience, right? Like your leadership, obviously, oh, I need resources, I need funding, I need approval, those sorts of things. But think of your team or dependent folks. I need your ideas, or I need your support, or can we go work on this together? Or are you willing to unblock this dependency for us, right? Or are you willing just to support us with your team? There's always an ask, or you wouldn't be telling them the story.
Yeah.
Even if it's just, my ask is, I'm here to inform you so that you feel like you're understand what's going on, right? But there has to be, you have to give them a why.
I suppose that's why that structure is so useful in many situations for a product manager, but even beyond that, no matter where you find yourself, is being able to, and this is how I designed my training for a long time, was saying, like, articulate the problem and get people then really wanting that they understand the problem and aligning to the problem and relating to it, and then saying, this is what it could look like. And then all you have to do then, if people want to know, what can I do? What ideas have you got? I recognize I relate to that problem and I really want to be where you're saying we could be. So tell me, like, what can you give me to help us get there? It's like, oh, wow. And I think it's a very powerful structure.
Huh.
But when do you know, Tara, when do you know if your story isn't working?
This is actually a great question, because it's not always the same answer, right? So we just had recently at Bill, we've been working on our design system alignment, and we started with the strategy for design system. We started articulating, okay, let's put on paper what the design system is, the strategy, and how we're going to address these issues that we have. But there was a big group of us working on it, and there's design impact, there's technology impact, there's product team impact, there's collective how we work across all these area impact, because the design system is like across all these areas. And we had the tech team talking to technology leaders, we had the design team talking to the design leaders, and people were getting like pieces of the story. And all of a sudden everyone's like, well, we're not thinking about this holistically. And it's actually the team is, but the stories they heard were not holistic. And so then we're like, okay, let's make sure we're not like giving pieces of it away without without people getting context of the whole. So we write it up, we start communicating it more broadly in the full context, and pieces of it are landing and pieces of it are not landing. And so we kind of go back to, okay, let's edit this piece, let's figure out this piece. And so it evolved over time. It's not like we went into a hole and wrote this perfect story and then came out and told it and it was like, boom, we nailed it from the beginning. Because your story can evolve, and it should evolve, especially when you're working on pieces that have so many connected teams, right? And this is actually what we talk about a lot in the class as well, is around how to work in these big matrix environments. And so what happened is the story kind of got tighter and it adjusted more for the different audiences as we went and as we learned. And so with every telling, the story got better. It got better. It got better. And so now I'm like, oh, we can all go boom, 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 go tell that story, and we can know how to adjust it for each audience. But it's not always perfect when it comes out the gate, because the thing is, you can have an idea of what the different audiences care about. Well, leadership generally cares about this. The engineering teams generally care about this, design, but different folks, everybody's an individual, right? And everybody has their own context in their head of like things they care about. And the design team may have been like, we may have assumed like, oh, they're really going to care about consistency, whereas engineering is going to care about speed. And like, we got to speed up our engineering. Well, actually, that's not wholesale true, right? Maybe design's like, hey, we're getting a lot of flack for not moving fast enough. And you've got some people there. So it's like you kind of learn the different audiences and what they care about as you go. And so I think it's fine if you're saying it's not working, it might not necessarily be you have the wrong story to tell. It may be that you just got to tweak and massage it. Maybe the form factor is wrong, right? Maybe you did a verbal story and you needed a written document because people wanted more context. Or maybe you gave a presentation, but people wanted the written document. Or maybe people wanted more of a one-on-one conversation and you gave like a presentation to 100 people. So there's all these different pieces you can adjust as you go, as long as you feel like the core structure and you're telling the right story at the right time. All the other pieces you can massage and improve.
I had like 2 or 3 things then come into my head, and like, I really want to ask these questions, but I'm also keeping an eye on the clock and wondering at some point we should maybe bring this episode to a close. But before we do, I would like to, it reminded me, always talk of storytelling, of the importance, I said, between correlation and causation. And it was only when I watched a video from a long time ago of Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the South Park creators, about a university in America somewhere. And they said that one of the biggest leaps they had in their storytelling in the early days was they used to use post-it notes on the board and then say, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and so on. And they said the biggest flip they had was when they stopped saying, and this happens, to start saying, and as a consequence of this, this will happen. So rather than just thinking of random stuff and piecing it together, they were just trying to think systemically and say, well, what's the cause and effect? Like, if that's going to happen, what could be the possible kind of consequences of this? And they found it actually made them make a stronger narrative flow. And I think it's easy, going back to what we were saying at the beginning, just to have correlation, just to believe what they want is consistency, what tech want is speed, when actually, like, that's just there may be just some correlation with what you've experienced in the past, and it may not be actually what those people want right now. And this is, I did a talk on this the other week when I was talking about arrogance-driven development. You know, when we so firmly believe the story we're telling is correct, that we don't do the research, and we think just because we are who we are, we have this kind of, right from consciously or unconsciously, it's very inflated sense of ourselves. I think it happens to us all. It's hard to, live without ego, and we do get wrapped up in ourselves sometimes. And I think that we get in this situation with this arrogance-driven development or arrogance-driven product management, but we believe so strongly that our story is the right story that we fail to actually do the research and find the causation and find the potential cause and effects, and end up with that believable, credible story, which brings people on board with it.
Yeah, there's a really hard balance to get between passion and just deep belief that you have that you need to get your story across, but also enough detachment from it that you're okay as if it shifts and changes and morphs, because you have to have that pragmatism in order for something to come to life. If you're dogmatic and this is the story and this is the way it has to be told and this is the only way it can succeed, you're actually gonna have a really hard time getting across, because a lot of times the best way you get buy-in is if you get people to feel like they were a part of the story. And if they see their feedback come in and they see something change and shift based on that, they're all of a sudden going to feel like they also are co-owners of that. And then it gets much easier for your story to take life.
So strong opinions held loosely turns my story into our story.
Exactly. That's a great one-liner. I should use that.
Yeah, have it. It's yours. I can't take any credit for the strong opinions held loosely. That was someone else, but never part was mine. Tara, let's bring this one to a close. I could carry this on for a long time, but unfortunately, time is finite, which is quite sad when you really think about what that means. Tara, we've covered so much, and we're going to come back for another episode. And we're going to start with user stories, I think, because you did some good work on user story pitfalls. And also, I think user stories are equally brilliant and awful. So I would love to explore that with you.
Let's do it.
Now, before we end the episode, though, you do have a course coming up. And by the time this episode is out there, your next course would have happened. But you were saying that hopefully you have some more courses offered in the spring. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we ran the first storytelling course in the summer. There's one coming up October, which may be past by the time this is out, but likely again in the spring. So
awesome.
And that's all through Reforge. So Reforge, we do all that through the Reforge platform.
Is this an accent thing? Should I be saying it Reforge, or am I okay to be English and call it Reforge? Like, well, how do you pronounce it?
Oh, now you have me self-conscious. Maybe
I'm not. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to go for Reforge. Like Geordie LaForge from Star Trek.
Ah, okay. That seems like a good model.
So we will come back for episode 2. I recommend anyone go into Reforge, check them out. There's some awesome courses on there and some brilliant people who have curated them, including Tara. So please do check out Reforge. And obviously make sure that you are subscribed to us on your podcast platform of choice, because we will be back next week with more Tara. So thank you for listening, Tara. Thank you for being such an awesome guest. And we'll pick up on user stories when we reconvene in 1 week's time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Al.
Well, there you have it. Who would have thought that learning how to be an expert storyteller in a day-to-day environment could be so easy to pick up? Tara shared so many golden nuggets. It's about the structure, how you can weave a story into your everyday life. It was just incredibly valuable and very practically useful. So we would love you to recommend this episode to a product leader, product manager, an agile coach. In fact, anybody that has a story to tell, a vision to share, the tips that Tara shared in this episode will be valuable to them. So we ask that you share this episode with a strong recommendation, of course, because we have Tara coming back for episode 2 of 2. And in this episode, Tara's going to be sharing about some of her experiences at GoDaddy, working with the CEO, and how he taught her an inception process which Tara uses to this day. We'll also be exploring user story pitfalls and going deep on the importance between balancing communication, verbal and written. Thank you very much for listening. It's always a pleasure to have you hang around to the end. And I'll say goodbye until next week. My name is Ben Maynard, and this is the Product Agility Podcast.